Breaking news. The European Union has just announced unprecedented economic sanctions against Britain as Royal Navy vessels are physically blocked from entering Mediterranean ports. Complete diplomatic meltdown. At 8:42 a.m. today, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen delivered an emergency address announcing immediate punitive measures against the UK. Every word measured and devastating. Naval blockades, financial restrictions, import bans on critical British goods. And most shocking of all, von der Leyen declaring Britain's unilateral violations of international law cannot continue without consequences. Within minutes, reports flooded in of Royal Navy vessels HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales being denied refuelling access in Spain and Italy. British cargo ships turned away from EU ports across the Mediterranean. UK financial transactions suddenly frozen. And as this crisis unfolds, leaked Foreign Office documents reveal Starmer was explicitly warned this exact scenario would happen, but dismissed concerns as Project Fear. If you want to understand how Britain's worst diplomatic crisis in decades could trigger economic collapse within days, hit that subscribe button now because events are accelerating by the minute. Here's what sparked this extraordinary European response. 3 weeks ago, the British government unilaterally implemented new fishing restrictions in disputed territorial waters around Gibraltar. Not routine regulatory adjustments, not standard policy changes. Sweeping new exclusion zones, barring Spanish and Portuguese vessels from waters they've accessed for generations. The move came without diplomatic consultation or negotiation through established channels. Spanish officials immediately condemned the action as violation of post-Brexit agreements and EU maritime law. Emergency diplomatic meetings were convened. The European Commission formally requested British suspension of the new restrictions pending proper negotiations. But the government response was increasingly dismissive. Foreign Secretary David Lammy publicly characterised the dispute as minor regulatory adjustment and suggested European concerns were disproportionate. When Spanish vessels attempted to continue traditional fishing activities, Royal Navy patrol boats began aggressive interdiction operations. Maritime confrontations escalated rapidly. Videos of Royal Navy vessels conducting dangerous manoeuvres near Spanish fishing boats circulated widely online. The European Commission issued 3 formal diplomatic warnings, each more urgent than the last, citing specific treaty violations and demanding immediate British withdrawal. After weeks of escalating tensions with no meaningful British engagement, the European Union finally took this extraordinary step. This wasn't just a fishing dispute. This was Britain's deliberate provocation of its largest trading partner through unilateral action in disputed waters and Europe's stunning collective response. The content of the EU announcement has left diplomatic and economic experts stunned. In her address from Brussels, Commission President von der Leyen explicitly cited Britain's systematic disregard for international obligations and repeated pattern of unilateral action violating agreed frameworks. Most significantly, she announced a graduated response mechanism beginning with immediate measures but potentially escalating if British policy remains unchanged. The first stage sanctions include temporary suspension of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement regarding fisheries and maritime transport, freezing of certain financial services passporting rights, and enhanced inspections of all British goods entering EU territory, effectively creating debilitating delays for British exporters. Most concerning for Britain's economic stability, von der Leyen announced the Commission was preparing second-stage measures targeting energy interconnection, air transport, and financial services more broadly if the situation remains unresolved after 14 days. The deliberate escalation approach, rather than full immediate implementation, signals precisely how seriously Europe views this situation while still providing diplomatic off-ramps. Former EU Trade Commissioner Lord Mandelson appeared on BBC explaining the extraordinary significance. These aren't symbolic gestures. These are precisely calibrated economic measures designed to create maximum pressure on specific British interests while remaining technically proportionate under international law. The European response wasn't just angry. rhetoric. It was carefully designed economic pressure targeting Britain's most vulnerable sectors with clinical precision. As former Foreign Office Permanent Secretary Sir Simon MacDonald noted on Channel 4 News, the EU has effectively weaponised Britain's economic dependencies with surgical precision, demonstrating just how vulnerable post-Brexit Britain remains to European economic pressure. The immediate impact has been devastating across multiple sectors of British economy and society. In Portsmouth Naval Base, families of Royal Navy personnel gathered in anxious groups as news spread that HMS Queen Elizabeth, Britain's flagship aircraft carrier conducting Mediterranean exercises, had been denied refuelling access in Rota, Spain. Sarah Williams, whose husband serves aboard the carrier, told local reporters they're stuck at sea with limited fuel reserves and nowhere to dock. This isn't politics, this is putting our people at risk. In Dover, Europe's enhanced inspection regime immediately created 17-mile lorry queues as British exports faced comprehensive documentary and physical checks. James Thompson, a haulage company owner from Kent, described the situation as catastrophic on Radio Kent. We're looking at 9 to 12-hour delays minimum. For fresh produce, that's not delay, that's destruction. Financial services firms reported clients suddenly unable to complete euro-denominated transactions as certain passporting rights were suspended. British tourists in EU countries discovered their UK bank cards declined for hotel payments and cash withdrawals as financial restrictions took effect. The European Medicines Agency announced precautionary review of certain pharmaceutical supply chains from Britain, triggering panic among patients dependent on imported medications. While these ordinary citizens face genuine hardship and uncertainty, government ministers who triggered the crisis enjoy continued security and privilege. Foreign Office officials were spotted entering the back entrance of Whitehall buildings, avoiding journalists' questions. The contrast is so stark, so fundamentally unjust, that even traditional Labour supporters expressed outrage. Former Labour Europe Minister Denis McShane didn't mince words on LBC. This government has managed to provoke our largest trading partner into economic sanctions through diplomatic incompetence on a scale I've never witnessed. This isn't politics anymore. This is governance failure with real human consequences. Polls hastily conducted today show 76% of respondents calling the situation deeply concerning or frightening, including 68% of Labour voters. The damage isn't just diplomatic, it's a profound breach of government's most fundamental duty to ensure national security and economic stability. But then something extraordinary happened that sent shockwaves through the entire British establishment. At precisely 2:45 p.m, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte issued an unprecedented statement expressing serious concern about escalating tensions between alliance members and announcing emergency consultations at NATO headquarters. Not routine diplomatic language, not general expressions of concern. Direct intervention in what NATO characterises as potentially destabilising security situation in the Mediterranean theatre. Most significantly, the Gunn statement referenced NATO's founding principle that members resolve disputes peacefully and refrain from actions that threaten collective security interests. Military experts were stunned. This wasn't diplomatic disagreement. This was NATO effectively warning Britain that its actions were creating alliance security concerns. Former Supreme Allied Commander Europe Admiral James Stavridis explained the extraordinary significance on Sky News. When NATO formally expresses concern about a member state's actions, this isn't routine diplomatic communication. This is the alliance signalling fundamental alarm about behaviour threatening collective security arrangements. Most concerning was NATO's announcement of special monitoring of naval movements in the region and contingency planning for potential further escalation, diplomatic language for preparing military deconfliction protocols. Former Defence Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkin described this as alliance crisis management on World Hafen. At one, NATO has essentially placed Britain and Spain under special monitoring to prevent military miscalculation. This is intervention reserved for situations with genuine escalation risk. The fact that NATO feels this necessary between two alliance members is unprecedented and deeply alarming. The economic impact has been immediate and potentially catastrophic for Britain's already fragile economy. Within hours of the EU announcement, the pound sterling crashed 4.7% against the euro in the largest single-day drop since Brexit. The FTSE 100 plunged nearly 6%, wiping billions from pension investments and corporate valuations. UK government bonds saw yields spike sharply as markets priced in significant economic disruption and potential ratings downgrades. International investors began quietly shifting assets away from British exposure. Major European investment banks, including Deutsche Bank and BNP Paribas, issued urgent guidance to clients warning of significant UK market volatility and potential systemic financial transmission channels if the crisis extends beyond 2 weeks. By mid-afternoon, the Bank of England announced an emergency meeting to discuss potential intervention to stabilise markets' central bank code for preparing crisis measures. Economic forecasters revised UK growth predictions downward by 0.8% for the next quarter, with Oxford Economics warning that sustained sanctions could trigger a technical recession. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research calculated potential economic damage exceeding £8 billion if the dispute remains unresolved for 1 month. Most alarmingly, the British Retail Consortium warned of potential supply disruption for certain food products as European suppliers prioritise non-UK customers amid transport delays. The economic damage isn't theoretical. It represents real British jobs, investments, pensions, and potentially even food security suddenly placed at risk through diplomatic incompetence. Inside Westminster, total chaos has engulfed Starmer's government. Cabinet unity has completely collapsed, with ministers openly divided between those defending the Gibraltar policy and those demanding immediate reversal. Defence Secretary John Healey reportedly had a furious confrontation with Foreign Secretary David Lammy over the maritime situation during emergency cabinet calls. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds is described by sources as incandescent with rage about not being properly consulted before implementing measures with catastrophic economic consequences. Most significantly, leaked WhatsApp messages show Chancellor Rachel Reeves warning Lammy 3 weeks ago, this Gibraltar approach creates unacceptable economic risk. Finance sector exposure alone makes this strategy reckless. That warning was apparently dismissed, with Lammy reportedly responding, "Trade concerns are secondary to territorial integrity. Treasury needs to stay in its lane. Government." Whips report Labour MPs in constituencies with manufacturing and export businesses are facing unprecedented pressure from employers suddenly facing existential threat. WhatsApp groups with names like Economic Disaster Response and Sanctions Damage Limitation have formed among backbenchers demanding immediate policy reversal. One senior civil servant described the atmosphere as beyond crisis management. Ministers don't know whether to defend the policy, modify it or abandon it entirely, they revealed. When your largest trading partner imposes economic sanctions and NATO expresses security concerns, there's no middle ground left. Most concerning of all, sources within the diplomatic service report that multiple European counterparts are now refusing calls with Lammy, an extraordinary breakdown in communication channels. Former Foreign Office Minister Sir Alan Duncan described this situation as diplomatic isolation on World at One. When counterparts won't even take your calls, traditional diplomacy becomes impossible. You're no longer in disagreement, you're in relationship breakdown. But here's the most explosive revelation that could deliver the final blow to the government's credibility. Multiple sources confirm that before implementing the controversial Gibraltar measures, Foreign Office legal advisors explicitly warned the actions would likely violate multiple international agreements and could trigger legitimate EU countermeasures. According to 3 separate sources with direct knowledge, an internal legal assessment specifically cautioned the proposed maritime restrictions in contested waters would constitute prima facie a breach of Articles 17 and 28 of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement and potentially violate UNCLOS provisions regarding innocent passage rights. The assessment explicitly warned of proportionate but significant countermeasures available to the European Union under international law, potentially including suspension of agreement provisions regarding fisheries, maritime transport, and financial services. Most damning of all, this legal warning was reportedly acknowledged but overruled by ministerial direction, with Lamy allegedly commenting, "Legal risks are acceptable given political imperatives. If these accounts are accurate and multiple senior sources confirm they are, they reveal this wasn't diplomatic miscalculation. This was deliberate provocation despite explicit warnings of the consequences." Think about what that means. Not misunderstanding, not technical oversight. Knowingly implementing policy expected to trigger economic sanctions against Britain during a cost of living crisis. When asked directly about these internal warnings, a Foreign Office spokesperson gave an answer that effectively confirmed their existence. Legal advice on policy implementation remains confidential, but forms one of several factors in ministerial decision-making. One of several factors? When? That advice explicitly warned of economic sanctions. Former Foreign Office legal advisor Sir Daniel Bethlehem explained the extraordinary significance on Newsnight. If ministers received clear legal warning about treaty violations and potential sanctions and proceeded anyway, that potentially crosses the line from political misjudgment to knowing violation of ministerial responsibility for treaty compliance. That's why this revelation is so potentially serious for the government. Meanwhile, opposition leader Rishi Sunak is orchestrating a masterful response that further isolates Starmer's government. Rather than simply attacking the government, Sunak convened an emergency meeting with business leaders directly affected by the sanctions to develop practical solutions. Standing alongside executives from major exporters, financial services firms, and logistics companies, Sunak struck exactly the right tone. This isn't about politics. This is about British jobs, businesses, and economic stability needlessly placed at risk through diplomatic failure. He announced an unprecedented economic protection framework proposal, a detailed alternative approach to the Gibraltar situation that would address sovereignty concerns while complying with international obligations. The proposal has already received positive signals from European officials and endorsement from major business organisations. The contrast couldn't be more devastating for Starmer. While the government scrambles to contain a diplomatic and economic crisis of its own making, Sunak presents practical solutions. While ministers defend policies triggering sanctions, Sunak builds international consensus. The political implications are seismic. Conservative polling has surged to 41%, with Labour falling to 29%. But beyond polling, the more profound shift is in governance credibility. As respected international relations expert Professor Anand Menon observed on Politics Live, we're witnessing something remarkable. A Labour government being portrayed as diplomatically reckless and economically irresponsible, while the Conservative opposition positions as the party of international engagement and economic stability. This completely inverts traditional political alignment. With each passing hour of inadequate government response, this perception deepens. The next 24 hours are absolutely critical for both Britain's economic stability and international standing. The COBRA Emergency Committee has been activated to coordinate response across government departments. The Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee is meeting continuously to monitor market stability. The Ministry of Defence has established emergency communication channels with NATO to prevent maritime escalation. The Foreign Office has reportedly begun drafting potential compromise positions, though European officials indicate simple reversal of the Gibraltar measures may no longer be sufficient without additional concessions. The Treasury is meeting with business organisations to assess economic impact and develop support mechanisms. This isn't just a diplomatic disagreement anymore. This is a fundamental challenge to Britain's post-Brexit international strategy and economic resilience. As former National Security Advisor Lord Sedwill explained on Today programme, Britain's post-Brexit international positioning relies on maintaining constructive relations with Europe while pursuing global opportunities. when that European relationship fractures to the point of economic sanctions and NATO concern, the entire foundation of our international strategy is threatened. At the epicenter stands Keir Starmer, a Prime Minister who, according to former British Ambassador to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, now faces the most serious diplomatic and economic crisis with Europe since Brexit, entirely self-inflicted through provocative action that ignored explicit warnings of the consequences. So here's the question that matters. Did the British government deliberately provoke this crisis despite legal warnings of sanctions? Will the economic damage force immediate policy reversal, or will false pride prolong the suffering? And can Britain's critical European relationships recover from this diplomatic catastrophe? What do you think? Has territorial posturing in Gibraltar damaged Britain's economic security beyond repair? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story shocked you as much as it shocked us, share it with everyone who needs to understand the true economic and security impact of this diplomatic crisis. The mainstream media won't tell you the full implications of how ministerial recklessness threatens British jobs, businesses, and international standing, but we will. And tomorrow, we'll reveal what European Commission officials told business leaders in emergency consultations today. Conversations that expose exactly how comprehensive the KEPO next round of sanctions will be if Britain doesn't reverse course immediately. This isn't just about fishing rights. It's about whether Britain can maintain essential European economic relationships while pursuing independent policies. The answer will shape Britain's prosperity and security for decades to come.